We are speaking today with Karen Parker. She is an attorney specializing in human rights and armed conflict law. She is the founder of the Association of Humanitarian Lawyers, as well as the UN representative of the Humanitarian Law Project. Karen, thank you for spending time with us today.
Happy to be here, Mike.
Last time we spoke with you, we were discussing your petition before the OAS. And I'm hoping we can eventually get to some detail on what's been happening with that. But before that, you have just come back from Port Townsend here in Washington, and I'm wondering if you can tell us what brought you to our sunny shores.
Well, two reasons. One, the Port Townsend Depleted Uranium Study Group wanted to have me discuss depleted uranium, why it's illegal, what the UN action has been on depleted uranium, and because, of course, depleted uranium is part of the Organization of American States petition for Fallujah, which is what we discussed last time. At the same time, Congressman McDermott's office hosted a meeting so I could discuss some of the same issues relating to depleted uranium with some of the leaders in the Seattle community that have been working on this issue.
What has been the ruling in the past with depleted uranium at the UN level?
Well, the United Nations has determined that the use of depleted uranium weapons is incompatible with international law, existing international law, which means that depleted uranium use in battle is illegal. I know that you've had people discussing depleted uranium on your show before, but just to briefly review depleted uranium is a byproduct of uranium, and it is turned into a metal. The metal is used in projectiles. It is extremely hard, so these projectiles are very, very good. They go through a tank like knife through butter is the way it's usually described. The problem is that when depleted uranium fires and hits a target, it's polyphorous. It means that it explodes and burns. When it burns, it vaporizes, and when it's breathed in, it has a very, very serious effect on the human body. Many of the scientists who were looking into depleted uranium back in as early as the 50s, looking into low-grade radiation poisoning, identified a number of problems from exposure to low-grade radiation, and exposure to depleted uranium dust is that kind of low-grade radiation. So what we saw as a result of the Gulf War I was an enormous number of our troops being infected with illnesses and conditions and anomalies that are linked to low-grade radiation, and the fact that their offspring showed a very, very high incidence of disability. When I found out about depleted uranium in 1996, I knew that it was impossible to use such a weapon in a way that would be legal. So I brought that situation to the United Nations, but first the Commission on Human Rights in 1996, and in the summer of 1996, the Subcommission on Human Rights that sits under the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. These sessions are in Geneva. And lo and behold, the opinion at the Subcommission was exactly the same as mine. You hear about depleted uranium and you know it's illegal. You know this is just shocking, absolutely shocking and inhumane. And within a week of my testimony and sessions that we had and talking with members of the Subcommission, they adopted a resolution which indicates that the use of depleted uranium weapons is incompatible with existing law and is hence illegal. Now, sometimes people ask me, well, but what was their legal reasoning? You know, what is it about depleted uranium that makes it illegal? Well, the first rule of weapons is that the weapon has to be containable to the legal field of battle. So if you target a tank, you can't have what hits the tank also hit a school or a place that is not a legal military target. The problem with depleted uranium is it vaporizes, and the vapor just leaves the tank and goes over to a hospital, goes over to a school, goes over to a civilian neighborhood, a market. It can even go across the border and attack people with whom you're not at war, which is also illegal. The war has to be contained to the legal field of battle. So if it's country A against country B, country A can only fire on military targets of country B. But if when they do that, the residue scatters all over the place, then that's an uncontainable weapon. Another way it's talked about is it's indiscriminate. It doesn't only attack. You can't say to that DU, now stay right there, don't go next door. But it goes next door. So it fails the test for territory. The second thing about depleted uranium is it relates to a very simple rule. When the war is over, and the war has to stop. Depleted uranium doesn't stop. It continues to kill and maim and cause birth defects years and years and years. Some people have described it that we will be at war with Iraq till the end of Earth because we cannot turn off the weapons that we used against Iraq. This is the time test. You have to be able to stop the weapons at the end of the war. Depleted uranium has a half-life of 4.5 million years, so we are at war with Iraq for the end of time. Third, and this is a principle that arises from the very first rules of armed conflict law, weapons and methods of warfare cannot be unduly inhumane. And when you have a weapon that causes birth defects in the children of your own soldiers, not counting your enemy, 5, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years after the war, when you talk about a weapon that gives your own soldiers or civilians in your enemy country cancers, bone cancers, leukemia, pancreatic cancer, lung problems, even during the war, but certainly long after the war is over, you can't call that a humane weapon. There's a potential genocidal aspect of depleted uranium because what it does to the DNA in the human gene, it affects the human genome, which is why there's such a high incidence of disability. The fourth problem with depleted uranium is it can't pass the clean environment test. Armed conflict law rules now require that weapons cannot unduly harm the environment. Well, you have a weapon that sprays radioactivity all over the water, all over the fields. The cattle are breathing it in, the chickens are breathing it in. We don't know ultimately how bad the ecological effect will be, but we certainly know it's bad. The international community looking at these 4 tests and what DU does said, it's completely incompatible. It fails the test miserably. You can't control it. You can't turn it off. It's inhumane, and it harms the environment. Now, some people say it should be banned. But I argue, and the UN says it's already banned. It's bad enough that it's banned. We certainly need to look at it more to know how to better remedy the victims. But we know it's already banned. And this is what the Port Townsend people and Congressman McDermott's office were very, very concerned about. What's the next step when you know it's banned? Now what do we do? And that's one of the reasons that, of course, we went to the Organization of American States, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, because that's a forum where we can raise the use of depleted uranium in armed conflict.
So is that something that you did in addition to your petition to the OAS, or is that part of your petition to the OAS?
It's part of the petition on human rights. It's part of the petition at the Organization of American States. We allege that the United States violated the right to health and life of the patients and medical personnel and other people in Fallujah General Hospital, as well as wanton destruction of the facilities, the ambulances, the clinics. And we said the use of depleted uranium also has a very negative effect on the right to health of those particular victims. So it's a way of, first of all, challenging the frontal assault on the Geneva Conventions at all, but by even having targeted a hospital. But it's also a way to get the depleted uranium issue before yet another forum, so that we can have a forum that will actually ask the United States to do something specifically about those particular victims. The UN didn't speak of any particular victims, it just said the use is incompatible, which means the US is on notice and the rest of the world is on notice, but it doesn't address a specific situation, a specific armed conflict and a use. It just frames the law. Following the resolutions of the United Nations finding depleted uranium illegal, it set up a process by which one of its members wrote a rather detailed report and then a second report on why depleted uranium and bad weapons are illegal. In other words, setting out my test, my 4-point test, in an official UN document. The second report, however, did raise specific issues regarding United States depleted uranium use in the 2003 attack on Iraq, because the report came that summer. So it addresses a lot of the environmental concerns as well as the physical concerns of the use of depleted uranium.
So where does this go from here then? What is the next step?
Well, the next step for the United Nations is, in a sense, almost unneeded. The United Nations has completed its work. It looked into the question. It answered the question. The question was, is depleted uranium legal? And the United Nations said no. And the United Nations very clearly set out why depleted uranium is illegal. And following, coincidentally, my same legal reasoning, but in a sense, it's not coincident. Anyone with specialty in humanitarian law is going to come to exactly the same conclusion, exactly the same way. The next step, as far as the OAS petition, is to continue to compile information. We've gotten some from Dar Jamail, who I think was interviewed at your station. My last trip to Geneva, I met with people with very close contacts with doctors in Iraq and ways of getting specifics on the ground in Fallujah now, because one of the issues is the degree to which the United States is remedying. We've alleging the United States made these attacks and then didn't do anything, didn't help, left people dead and dying in the street, left people, the hospitals in shambles, hasn't returned health care in any way, shape, and form to Fallujah. So it's both the original violations and the continuing violations, because the United States is under an affirmative duty to tend to the health care needs of the Iraqi people. And if they don't do it directly, they have to allow others to do it, and they're not allowing others to do it either. So we want to get to the next step at the Organization of American States. With our meeting today with Congressman McDermott's staff that had a wide array of people in the city of Seattle, I was very, very pleased to see people from so many walks of life concerned about depleted uranium. In fact, that only reinforces one of the other rules to know if a weapon is illegal. A fundamental rule of armed conflict law is derived from the fact we don't know what bad stuff governments will come up to as far as weapons or styles of warfare. You know, the human mind and how weapons are developed and what they have in mind for weapons it's unlimited, and much of it is very, very evil. So a fundamental principle of the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions is, because we don't know what's down the road, we have to have concepts of law that protect for what may be over the line. And that is from the Hague Conventions, particularly 1907, and it says at all times, combatants and civilians alike are protected by principles of law of civilized nations. So you can't have the kind of ruling that came down today that said Geneva Conventions allow murder of a wounded, unarmed person in a mosque. Actually came out with that ruling that is absolutely against the principles of law of civilized nations, absolutely 100%. Number two, people are always protected by principles of humanity. So when you see something like that and you're incensed, that in itself is an indication that what you saw is illegal. Principles of law of civilized nations, and the really good one is the dictates of the public conscience. If the public rallies, forms groups, committees like Port Townsend, tries to work on it like Congressman McDermott, and have a meeting in Seattle where people from all walks of life indicated in their introduction that when they heard about depleted uranium, they knew they had to do something about it. It's that kind of thing which illustrates the dictates of the public conscience. And that's another way of saying, well, of course DU is illegal. Look at what people are doing to stop it. Look at how it has invoked the dictates of the public conscience. So even if we didn't have the clear-cut rules that we do have, we could use that. And that alone is proves the illegality of depleted uranium weapons. Congressman McDermott's office wants to take his work to the next step. He wants to reintroduce his bills to address depleted uranium. He's probably going to add provisions to stop its use, which is a reflection of the dictates. You've got to stop it. You know, when something really, really bad is going on like that, you can't let it go on. Our own soldiers are coming back and having deformed babies. There was a witness from Bainbridge Island that said of the returned vets in that area, which isn't that large, the incidence of babies born with birth defects is at least twice, if not 3 times higher than normal. So the next step there is to support McDermott's new efforts to get other legislators to do it and really call other legislators to task for why they haven't spoken up. If they're ignorant, fine, we're going to educate you. In fact, some of the citizens in this room had gone to see another legislator from Washington State who, surprisingly enough, incredibly enough, in a meeting last week, did not know about depleted uranium, had never heard of it. We have young men and young women on the ground at war. Our members of Congress, some of them, don't know what they're doing there or what they're using. They know nothing about the weapons. They don't know, of course, about the illegality of the weapons. They don't even know the rules of war. But they're putting our young men and women in situations without knowing the rules. That's absolutely unconscionable. Absolutely unconscionable. So the group was also hoping to be able to educate some of these legislators, and the ones who don't know about depleted uranium are not limited to Washington State, unfortunately. So some of the groups that were there, including the United Nations Association, which has affiliate chapters all over, or Veterans for Peace that have chapters all over, are going to be meeting with their members of Congress as well to inform them, first of all, about depleted uranium. Second of all, to let them know they expect their legislators to know the rules of war. If they're going to send our young men and young women into battle, they better know. And they better know that when they get statements from either the Attorney General or for the Pentagon that are clearly wrong from the absolute basics of armed conflict law, they better know enough to know that what they've been told is wrong. And they should know enough to know where to look it up if they're not sure. But from what I've heard come from our Attorney General, from some of these rulings, and from the position of the United States on why it attacked the hospitals in Fallujah, what they're saying is absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. In fact, becomes an admission of a war crime.
It's not unusual to see, for instance, in letters to the editor in papers, people saying, well, we are now in this war on terror, and therefore the previous rules no longer apply. What's your take on that, and do the Geneva Conventions still have teeth?
The war on terror is not a war as a normal war. So it's a misnomer to call efforts to combat terrorism an armed conflict. Terrorists exist because specifically they are not soldiers. They can't win militarily. They can't field an army with tanks and planes, etc., etc. They act surreptitiously. They're under the underground. They carry out operations that aren't military operations. They're common criminals engaged in very bad crimes. But it's not a war. Now, when we capture combatants in a war, and most people can tell a war, they just think of a John Wayne movie if you want to know what a war is. You have this group in a uniform combating that group in a uniform, and you have things, modern day, you have things like tanks and airplanes, you have jeeps, you have columns, you have openly shown weapons, you have cannons, you have whatever. That's an armed conflict. And when you're engaged in an armed conflict, the Geneva Conventions have to apply. If we throw them out, we might as well throw out civilization. The war on terrorism, however, is properly fought by more police-type actions. You're looking for a few people, an underground cell, somebody's hiding out. It's useless to drive a tank into a place where a so-called terrorist may be hiding out. That's not the weapon of choice. It's much more a police action. And the person seized in that should be treated like a common criminal. We don't like the crime, so all right, the penalty for that crime can be aggravated. You know, instead of life with ability for parole, you might want to have life with no possibility of parole. But you can't convert what are essentially police actions to find terrorists as a war. It doesn't look like a war, it doesn't feel like a war, it's not fought like a war. It's, in a sense, a rhetorical war, but it's not an operational war. And people need to know the distinction so we know what body of law to apply. What the United States is now doing is mixing apples and oranges and saying, and presenting us with this hybrid something or other, which really doesn't exist, but kind of a hybrid something or other, and say, therefore, no rules apply. You don't apply common criminal law, criminal justice systems, you don't apply Geneva Conventions, we're just going to make it up as we go along. That's not the rule of law. That's not the rule of law. So I think part of the value of these events are to help people see the difference between the apples and the oranges. Al-Qaeda is not an armed force. We may not like what Al-Qaeda does. We may want to capture them. But we're not capturing them with saturation bombing and tanks. We're trying to find them. We may use soldiers to try to find them, but the soldiers are essentially carrying out police activities, not an armed conflict.
And yet our media doesn't go very far in trying to demonstrate or illustrate what's really going on. For instance, one of Al-Qaeda's top people just recently got picked up in Pakistan, and Bush calls him a general.
Yes. The media tends to simply report what the members of our government say. They don't challenge the terminology. And the misuse of terminology is so rampant that the average American's head is upside down and backwards. It's as if our president tells us grass is red, so therefore we start calling grass red, and they forgot where they got the information that grass is red, but they know they're supposed to call it red now. So they're not even willing to look and verify that it's still green. It's a very, very dangerous situation. One of the most difficult forms of government is democracy. Absolutely the most difficult form of government, because it requires an informed people who know how to ask the right questions, people who challenge what their leaders say. It also requires an absolutely free and independent journalism, because the journalists are the source of information for the people. Journalists have to question the terminology and everything that is said by officials, not just merely quoted and go home, and then deny airspace for somebody who's questioning that terminology, and select who's important enough to have whatever they say headlines, and then unchallenged. We're at a very serious crossroads in our democracy because the people have apparently abrogated not only the right to know, but the obligation to know. And our media, for the most part, has abrogated its responsibility to find the truth and to present the truth, rather than an editorial position. Some of our congressmen have gone out to lunch, absolutely willing to let our young men and young women go to war without knowing the rules of war, and then listening to what people who have been proven to already be liars say about the status. They know they didn't find weapons of mass destruction. They knew that Saddam Hussein had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. They know XYZ, and they hear something coming out that sounds sort of wrong, but they don't say anything. We're at a very serious crisis time right now, both in terms of human rights in general, and certainly in terms of application of armed conflict law.
So summarize all this, if you could. Since we are in a democracy, our citizens then the ones that really have to challenge, are really the ones that have to be responsible for what's going on here? And can we be challenged internationally for not doing our part in conflicts like this?
In some countries we could, depending on what one is doing. If, for instance, after World War II, manufacturers of arms that were provided to the Nazis were tried in Nuremberg. So manufacturers who are manufacturing depleted uranium weaponry that is per se illegal may be triable for supplying material used illegally, that's used illegally in a war. The average citizen, unfortunately, no. Although I must say, the more people find out about depleted uranium, the more the dictates of the public conscience kicks in, and they get angry and they want to form groups. They want to stop it. Their friends come home and have deformed babies, and they really want to do something. So most people are motivated when it moves them, and one of the realities today is the atrocities are so huge that people are beginning to be moved to action. Congressman McDermott's staff says that this time around with his bill, he has more supporters than he did before. So some people are coming forward when they find out the information. And I think some members of the journalist field have felt somewhat remorse for parroting what was coming out of the administration without challenging it. And now we're caught in a huge, huge dilemma because they went along with it. And there's soul-searching going on there. Where I think there's a bigger problem is that there are many small lies day to day and many small erosions of rights day to day, and citizens don't seem to be willing to look in to challenge the small lies and to challenge the small erosions of their liberties. And as the lies get bigger and the erosion of our liberties gets bigger, it's possible by the time they wake up and say, oh my goodness, we've got to do something, it'll be too late. Challenging the Patriot Act, for instance, is a high priority, but groups are already being threatened by fears that they're going to be arrested and the key thrown away. They're going to be like some of these accused terrorists that are held in Never Never Land limbo and can't get out. You just can't spring them. You can't take a habeas corpus. You can't do this. You can't do that. So there is definitely a chilling effect on exercise of the democracy, and that's very, very troubling. So it allows such atrocities as a ruling that it's okay to kill an unarmed, wounded person in a mosque, point blank. And that was the ruling. It allows comments from our Attorney General that the Geneva Conventions are quaint and old-fashioned. If we didn't have the Geneva Conventions, we wouldn't have a globe anymore. It'd be gone long. So people have to realize the stakes now are extremely high. The weapons are extremely lethal and insidious. Some of the misstatements are huge. And yet people continue to vote against their own interests. It's a very big dilemma.
How can people find out more about your organization and your work?
We have a website, www.armedconflictlaw.org. Armed Conflict Law as one word. And much of the information on the Organization of American States petition against the United States for attacking the medical facilities in Fallujah is on that site. I think there's also a PayPal on there, so if people are motivated to support or find information and whatever, certainly motivated to support these kinds of efforts, I would certainly encourage them to do so. We're down to the last dime and we have a whole lot of work to do, and I'm very, very nervous that we will simply not have the money to do it. That brings up another issue, that one of the things that is happening with lawyers and human rights organizations is that our funding is drying up more and more as people are nervous. And I'm afraid it's going to get to the place where people no longer have a defense. They don't have anyone to help them with their defense. They don't have anyone to work on human rights because it's too risky. And we're definitely seeing that with the petition at the Organization of American States, but these PayPals are pretty anonymous. So anyway, I would encourage that. I would also encourage people to contact Congressman McDermott's office and express your support for his bill. If you have concerns about it and want it stronger, I would certainly urge you to do that as well. One of my messages is make it as strong as it needs to be to indicate how bad it really is. If you don't get the votes, we'll know who to go after. But people have to know it's really bad. Depleted uranium isn't something we need to study anymore. It's really bad. Its use has to simply stop because we can't afford the consequences. I would also encourage people, I know a lot of people have internet access and Google and other search engines. You can put in depleted uranium and Karen Parker or Karen Parker and depleted uranium. You can find out all kinds of information about the legal analysis, some of the UN actions. I mean, they pop up on these Google searches. And we're gonna persevere. We're gonna work as hard as we can. And we hope everyone else does as well.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending time with us today.